I'm Ben Ahrens, and I'm recording this video because several years ago, I got extremely sick and was actually bedbound for about 3.5 years. And during that time, as much as I'd like to say that I never lost hope, I remember struggling a lot physically, mentally, and emotionally, and completely losing hope. And so I wanted to share my story to let people know that there is hope. So first, I was always really interested in health and the human being and how the human body and mind could change and work together. In my teens and 20s, I got into exercise science and studied exercise physiology. And I remember becoming really fascinated with this concept that we could go from having an idea in our heads, like I'm going to get stronger, and then there was actually something we could do, like learn a series of exercise, such that by doing these exercises, we would actually become stronger. So I made that my career, started off and was writing for a newspaper, a fitness column, was training clients, was helping people with physical rehabilitation. And then in my mid-20s, something happened that was probably one of the most embarrassing things that could happen for any health professional. I completely lost my health, and it seemed like it went downhill just about overnight. I was on a surf trip in Senegal, West Africa, traveling and competing in a local competition. And mid-competition, my legs just completely gave out from under me. And I managed, after floating in the water a few minutes there, to climb my way back up to my board, make it back to the shore, but something was off. So I remember getting back to the hotel and just feeling exhausted from the travel. I'd been traveling for 36 hours the few days before, and figuring that as a relatively young, healthy person, I would just rest it off, and that I would bounce back on my feet within a few days. But a few days turned into a few weeks. I eventually ended up going home, and when I got there, exhausted, I remember crashing into bed and passing out and waking up and seeing spots the next day. After a few more weeks of resting with no change in symptoms, I noticed that my symptoms were actually starting to get worse. It went from this sort of peripheral sense of just exhaustion and fatigue and even some muscle aches and pains, almost like I had a flu, to a more central sense of brain fog, migrating pains and symptoms, malaise, and just a general feeling of being not at ease. So at this point, I went to the doctor, and he said, looks like you're getting over a bad cold or flu. Just take some more time off, chicken soup, TLC. Taking the good doctor's advice, that's what I did, but weeks turned into months. So I started going to more doctors. The more I looked, the more I found. One cardiologist found that my heart was beating irregularly, diagnosed me with POTS, which stands for postural orthostatic tachycardia. Basically, every time I changed my body posture or went from laying down to sitting up in the morning, my heart rate would shoot up to 140 beats per minute, and it felt like I was having a mini heart attack. And that led to the neurologist. He said, there's something going on with your brain. So they scanned my brain, did MRIs. They found brain lesions in the frontal cortex and gave me a diagnosis of MS, multiple sclerosis. So in a little bit of a panic, I continued down the road doing more tests, EKGs, nerve conductivity testing, all sorts of blood analysis, and I got back a whole range of results. One spinal tap found that I had a bad case of Lyme disease, that the antibodies for Lyme were some of the highest counts they'd ever seen in the cerebrospinal fluid, which is usually an indication that it's gotten into the central nervous system and started to cause some problems. So my initial reaction to that information was fear. Whenever we think of damage to the body, it never feels like a good thing. I remember also being in that mindset where I felt stuck. I felt like whatever happened or had happened was irreversible, was irreparable. And then especially when I got back these results about changes in my brain damage effectively, I remember feeling like my days were numbered. So at that point, I went down the road of pursuing treatments for the diagnosis of chronic neurological Lyme disease. It started off with oral antibiotics. When that didn't work, I went on stronger antibiotics until eventually I was on heavy dose intravenous antibiotics. I had a catheter that was stitched permanently, semi-permanently into my upper arm, feeding antibiotics directly into my heart. I had an oxygen condenser tank that I would sleep with every night and be tethered to all day. And my life essentially consisted of me having moved home at this point with my mother, sitting on her couch or laying on her couch, making a dent and just staying still, being in pain. At that point, I had probably been to 25 or more different specialists, again, neurologists, cardiologists, family medicine doctors, you name it. I went to them. We are very used to going to the doctor and having them have all the answers. That's why we go to the doctor. And it's comforting to know when you receive a diagnosis that there are answers there. But when it came to the diagnosis of chronic Lyme or chronic fatigue or juvenile rheumatoid arthritis or a lot of different strange diagnoses that were being thrown around, it's a little bit bittersweet, I found, because on the one hand, as nice as it is to be told what you have, on the other side of these same diagnoses, there's very little understanding of what to actually do about it. And so when that started to sink in, I felt like the bottom kind of had dropped out from under me. And I was sort of on my own to figure out what to do from here. At the time, I remember that sense of fear and hopelessness building. The more research I did on the internet, talking to other people with similar conditions, the more fearful I became and more hopeless I became as well. I think there's a lot of fearful information out there. And so I remember at a certain point, I don't know what it was in me, but I made a simple rule for myself. No more with the negative information, no more with the research. I'm going to go toward things that can either just make me feel neutral or anything that I could find and cling to a little bit of hope. At the time, this was in about 2009 or 2010, I couldn't read because of the cognitive symptoms. I had incredibly dense brain fog, migraine headaches, migrating symptoms. I was very sensitive to light and sound. I had to sleep every night with garbage bags over my windows and tape over the VCR. But I could listen to podcasts, and podcasts were just coming of age. I remember UC Berkeley was just starting to put some of their 1 and 200 level courses online. And so I started just listening to things that were interesting to me, that could maybe give me a little piece of hope. I took online courses effectively in biological medicine and brain neurology, neurobiology, and I started to hear about this thing called neuroplasticity. And I listened to an audiobook of Norman Doidge, who wrote this book called The Brain That Changes Itself. And in that book, I remember he talked about some incredible cases where people had actual structural brain damage and were able to completely heal and resolve their issues by supporting the brain's natural ability to change its structure and function. Up until that point, I felt just stuck. I felt like it was all downhill from here. The damage was done and things would just get worse. At that point, I remember a different perspective entered my mind. I remembered back to when I was a teenager and I was just starting to learn about exercise and science and that concept that you could actually change your body and change it for the better. And as I was listening to this idea of neuroplasticity and hearing these stories of people who were regaining sight and people who had never, who were deaf their whole lives and were now learning how to hear for the first time and using different parts of their brain, I started to get hopeful and wonder, maybe, just maybe there's a way that I can learn some new exercises and change my brain as well. So I went down that rabbit hole. I went to a neurologist at NYU Langone Medical, the one that had initially done the brain scans, and he turned me on to a neurocognitive rehab center in Manhattan that was doing some brain retraining exercises. And I started to learn, I started to apply, and slowly but surely, I started feeling some changes. I learned, mostly through my research into biological medicine, that the body ultimately is a self-healing system. Its nature is to be healthy. It has that innate capacity, and it can and will return there whenever the conditions permit. So then the question that came to mind was, okay, well, what are the conditions that are not allowing my body to return to this place of health and homeostasis? I learned about inflammation. I learned about the stress response, and I learned how the brain can learn to stay in high alert and keep the inflammation going that was somehow leading back to causing a lot of the symptoms. I learned how to take a pause. At first, for me, it was the only thing I could do was take a single deep breath. I would remind myself constantly throughout the day to take this breath. And what I found was that on the other side, I could find a little bit of peace, a little bit of stillness, a little bit of rest by not fighting against the symptoms. Interestingly enough, taking that deep breath over and over again actually started to make me feel physically better. I remember at first I felt just a little more energy. Then I felt a little more clarity. Where my brain had previously been wrapped in a fog 24/7, now I had a few usable hours a day. And while I still couldn't go outside and walk around the block just yet, I noticed that the lights were slowly coming back on. So I took it further. I said, what else can I do? And I started to learn about changing your environment, enriching your environment, how practicing new skills and doing things that challenged your brain a little bit outside of its comfort zone, like even simple things, brushing your teeth with the opposite hand, standing on one leg when putting on your pant legs, trying new hand gestures would actually essentially exercise and warm up the brain in ways that it hadn't been used before. It was a little bit haphazard at first. I tried a lot of different things and wasn't sure what was working or what wasn't. But the more I learned, the more I applied. And the more I applied, the more that little space, that pocket of expansion would start to spread out. And I found that I could stay in that place where maybe at first the symptoms were still there, but for whatever reason, they didn't seem to be impacting me as much. So with a little bit more clarity, I was able to start learning and applying more lifestyle changes. I changed my diet. At the time, I had become hypersensitive to gluten, various chemicals, even meats, and my diet was limited to basically just sweet potatoes. So I learned that the way we eat is actually as important as what we eat. And I learned how to eat in a way that put my mind and body in a more relaxed state. I changed my breathing patterns. I learned that even our posture and our subtle movements can change the way our brain functions. So I started making a lot of what from the outside may have looked like very subtle changes, but over time, they had a profound effect. By 2012 now, the lights are starting to come back on, having a little more leeway. I'm still not able to go out or see friends. And at the time, I remember feeling and being particularly isolated. But the changes that were happening, however small and subtle, were giving me real hope for the first time that I wasn't stuck, that things weren't static. And one of the biggest lessons I learned at this time is that nothing actually is static. Everything is changing. The only question is really, what direction is that change going in? What direction is that change taking us in? Can I have some influence into which direction I proceed? And as it turns out, the more we implement, the more we can. I remember going even deeper and learning how our thoughts themselves can lead to the perpetuation of inflammation in the body if we, say, dwell on negative events or dwell on how our symptoms feel. Whereas if we give ourselves that space, relax our bodies, we can actually send new information to the brain. And by practicing this, that inflammation can start to gradually come down. So at this point, anything that I could find that could give me a bit of hope, I would absorb it, put it into practice. And it wasn't a linear process. Not every day was an upward spiral. There was definitely ups and downs, but the very fact that I was feeling better overall was a strong signal back to me that I was going in the right direction. Latter half of 2012, 2013, around 10 months in of practicing various brain retraining exercises, I was getting back to normal. And for the first time in years, I could actually get back to work. I started part-time and remember working at an office building in Times Square, which was probably, in retrospect, a little bit too big of a leap. It was for someone with extreme sensitivities to light and sound, a big leap forward and a big challenge at the time. But I remember feeling incredibly grateful and happy that my body could get to this point. And at this point, it was like the end was in sight. I knew that I could get back if I had come this far. I ended up working with a company that was teaching biological medicine seminars and working with doctors from all over the world. We would assemble seminars with medical doctors, osteopaths, acupuncturists, neurologists, psychiatrists, psychologists, all different types of disciplines in one room. And for the next 7 or 8 years working in this way, I was like a sponge absorbing all of their knowledge and information as they were learning how to unravel some of the world's most complex chronic conditions. So at this time, working with all these doctors, things were going well. I was enjoying my career, learning a ton and applying new things to myself to continuously improve my health. At this point, I'd say I was back to full health. And so now naturally that light bulb went off in my head and I thought, okay, how far can I take this neuroplasticity thing? I did things I always wanted to do. I entered into a fundraiser and paddled to raise funds from Montauk to Block Island, which is an 18-mile open ocean crossing. I went to Thunderbolt Speedway, which is a motorcycle racing school, and learned how to race professional GP bikes. And I learned that the neuroplasticity exercises I'd been learning were actually applicable to going beyond full health. At this point, I was thrilled with everything I'd been doing and learning from the career that I had, but something was missing. And it was the ability to give people a way of healing themselves. So by this point, I could safely say I was back to full health. And by full health, I mean, I never had to think about it. It wasn't on my mind. My body was just supporting me in all the ways I needed it to. But something was missing. From all of these tools and treatments I was learning from these integrative doctors, well, it was wonderful to be able to see how patients could get treated in all of these new ways. What I felt was missing was the ability to give someone a tool to self-heal. And I had learned at this point that the body is that incredible self-healing mechanism. And there are specific things that anyone can do to improve their own brain and change the way their body functions. And looking back to 2019, the original mission of the company, Reorigin, was to, number one, replicate the results that I had created in others, and then give people a tool that they could use to reclaim their own health by retraining their brain. Throughout the years, first being a patient myself, then working with hundreds of different doctors, I had the opportunity to meet probably thousands of other patients by that point. People really struggling with things like chronic fatigue syndrome, arthritis, Lyme disease, brain fog, POTS, sensitivities, chemical sensitivities, electromagnetic field sensitivities, all of these different conditions that seem to be on the rise and have very little insofar as a specific protocol that can be followed to help them. And it was the many people and friends that I had who were struggling with these conditions that were really the impetus for me starting Reorigin. So also it was apparent in this time, 2019, that the healthcare system was really missing something. While they had developed a tremendous amount of expertise in things like emergency medicine and specific conditions like diabetes and heart disease, these huge categories of conditions that make up anywhere from 75 to 90% of doctors' visits, these chronic stress-related conditions, things that like those that I've mentioned, including the rise of anxiety and depression, were going largely unnoticed, unserved, and unsolved. So 2020 comes around, the pandemic strikes, and here we are seeing that anxiety is on the rise, depression is on the rise, chronic conditions are on the rise, and now we have COVID and then long COVID. Pretty early on, we recognized what this could be. It seemed a lot like what I experienced with chronic Lyme. And as it turns out, there's a lot of literature going back to the 1970s about conditioned immune suppression and post-viral fatigue or post-infectious syndrome that talks about how these flu-like symptoms and conditions can linger for long after the period of acute infection, very similar to what I experienced with Lyme. So this was our time. We had to go. We saw that people needed help, and we brought together the best team we could. We created the program as it exists today. We assembled this protocol, and we started working with people. And we found that they started to self-heal and get better. Today, we have a thriving community with several thousand members, and it's become clear that community is important, especially as we saw in 2020, 2021, and so forth. People coming together with an eye toward healing is very helpful for taking steps forward. I always say, and I think I mentioned it in this program, that the first step to healing is believing that you can. I remember this effect called the Roger Bannister effect that some people might have heard of. So Roger Bannister was the first one ever to break the 3-minute mile. So he ran a mile in less than 4 minutes. Prior to that time, it was thought to be, it was known to be physically impossible. No one could do it. But the moment he did it, others started to do it as well. It became almost commonplace. Once that mental barrier had broken, all of a sudden, within a year, high school students were running this 3-minute mile. And so thinking back to my own illness journey, a huge limiting factor was not knowing or believing that there was any way forward. So now when I see people joining the community, it's ultimately the environment that I wish I had, the thing that I wish I had to help me recover. Every day, people are breaking the 3-minute mile. Every day, people are believing and taking steps forward. And every day, we're seeing people get real results. So one of the things that I find most exciting and encouraging about this time is there's more research coming out. More people than ever are knowledgeable about things like neuroplasticity, brain retraining, and how you can actually have a large influence over your own health and well-being. Ultimately, I would love to see a program like this go from being a last resort to more of a first response for many people, so they don't have to